So I recently made a video exploring the history of the Dwarf Ranger unit from Warhammer Fantasy. You should see a link to it here if you haven't already. It is certainly an interesting video, and I think it was really fun for me to learn a bit about a unit that always stood out in the Dwarf Army roster. What stands out to me, of course, is just how versatile the Dwarf Ranger units actually are. Very few units in Warhammer Fantasy have that level of options with regards to equipment, although I think it has certainly fluctuated with the additions. But keen-eyed viewers might note that Dwarf Rangers cannot take handguns, one of the weapons that I think is distinctly dwarven. Of course, that's not to say that they never have. Preempting actually, there was a White Dwarf article where Dwarf Rangers were equipped with firearms as part of a campaign rule set. Specifically, I'm talking about White Dwarf 298, the UK version, because apparently there are different versions of the same White Dwarf article. A segment is presented here called Bugman's Lament. Joseph Bugman is of course a famous dwarf character and one of the most legendary brewmasters in Warhammer Fantasy history. The campaign details the tragic loss of his brewery and its aftermath, which is told over a series of articles. Given how important alcohol is to dwarf culture, you can imagine that the loss of Bugman's brewery is, of course, one of the greatest crimes ever committed against dwarf kind. But I digress. In this campaign, there are special rules for all the characters that are featured here, plus some for unique units that you might also be able to field. One of the profiles is, of course, for a Dwarf Mountain Ranger unit. Like regular Rangers, the Mountain Rangers have some of the options like shields, but unlike the regular Rangers, the Dwarf Mountain Rangers come equipped with handguns by default, and they have an option to swap them for blunderbusses for free. That's unusual, isn't it? To me, the Ranger unit is one that represents the limited avenue for freedom that exists in dwarf society. Pretty much every role and function in dwarf society is heavily regimented and restricted. Even slayers, arguably the few dwarfs that have shed most, if not almost all, of their entire social role, they're still bound by oaths about how they can act. Of course, in the process of killing themselves by fighting some powerful or fearsome enemy. Rangers, by contrast, have a life. Yes, it's a difficult life, but it is a kind of freedom, and I do find that interesting in dwarf society. And, of course, the fact that the Ranger unit has so many options, I think perfectly reflects the freedom that they experience in their own lives. Yeah, they're Rangers. Of course they're going to be able to decide whether or not they want to have a shield or a throwing axe or a great weapon. It's up to them to decide personally what they feel comfortable with and what they need for their particular mission. So the question is, why don't Dwarf Rangers use handguns in current times? Why are they stuck with crossbows? I've thought about it, and I want to present some arguments for and against. You can let me know in the comments which side of the fence you fall on. So, like any good dwarf argument, I think it's best to start by defending the status quo. Dwarfs are, as I'm sure you know by now, a fairly conservative people. They are loath to accept any changes to their way of life or their society, even if those changes would result in improvements. Dwarf crossbows are not the piddly things that are used by the Dark Elves, or the cruder contraptions made by humans. No, they are, for all intents and purposes, extremely lethal implements of warfare, and are as finely made as any other dwarf weapon or object. Crossbows in the game, of course, are strength 4, just like handguns, with a range of about 30 inches. Sure, they don't have AP 1 like handguns do, but on a 6 you get AP 2, and who doesn't like a bonus treat when rolling a 6? Against most sorts of enemies, I think that the crossbow is a perfectly adequate weapon compared to the handgun in a mechanical sense. But what about lore? Well, for starters, there are good reasons that I think that Dwarf Rangers might want to have crossbows over black powder weapons. Crossbows do not make a huge racket when they fire. Yeah, they're not perfectly silent, as sometimes video games make them seem, but the twang of the string is definitely not comparable to the roar of a black powder weapon going off. Furthermore, the weapon doesn't throw up a huge cloud of smoke when it's fired. While we tend to think of Dwarf Rangers as basically being a part of our armies, fighting in field battles, the reality is the foremost place of a Ranger is ambushing an enemy column that has no idea that the Ranger is there. The ability of the Rangers to do their job, I think, would be greatly impeded if they had to deal with the fact that their weapons would give away their positions when they fired them. I certainly think that the extra range helps too. Whether or not you believe that a handgun should have a lower range than a crossbow, that's a separate question, probably a video for another day. But it certainly would help the Rangers to accomplish their mission. Rangers are, of course, fairly good at shooting, so it means that the Rangers can probably engage their foes from further afield. And it also means that they'd be less likely to be in harm's way themselves. That, I think, is very important because, of course, the dwarf people can not afford needless losses. I think it also helps that the Rangers can salvage the bolts that do not break from the corpses of their enemies, and that of course would go a long way to increasing their supply of ammo when they're far from resupply. Crossbows are also, of course, things that rely on the considerable muscle power of the dwarf users. While dwarfs are pretty excellent and fairly strong, it has to be noted that it will take a lot of muscle power to span a crossbow, but it doesn't really cost you anything else. The same can't be said for black powder weapons, which need that precious material in order to actually function. Thus, I think a crossbow would allow a ranger to operate further afield from supply requirements, because you just need to have sufficient access to bolts. As long as you have bolts and a strong arm, you can fire a crossbow, which is not exactly the same for a handgun. So I'd like to start my rebuttal by calling my opponents old-fashioned, but that's just a compliment in Dwarf Halls. So instead, let's consider that while the handgun is 24 inches in range, Dwarf Rangers have heavy armor by default and also the option for shields. They're not unprotected, so if they might need to wade into a bit of enemy fire, I think they can shrug off attacks from weaker weapons like bows. It's not as if having access to a crossbow would prevent them from being shot at by a cannon. It's just a question of whether or not they might have to be outranged by bows, and let's be honest, bows are very weak, generally, unless of course you're talking about those special wood elf bows. Those things are nasty, but I digress. I think that the handgun is just more consistent with AP1. Yeah, you'd probably reduce most of the infantry in the game, which is somewhere between medium to light infantry, to a 5 or 6+ save. Not to mention that on a 6, you take them down even further. Handguns have a level of consistency that I think is important when you're thinking about shooting at a target, and the thing about dealing with Dwarf Rangers is that you have to use good positioning anyway, right? Using your Dwarf Rangers as standard ranged infantry is a bad use of Dwarf Rangers, so you should definitely be just doing good positioning anyway, and I think that would go a long way towards alleviating the problems with the shorter range of the guns. But of course, we're here for lore, so what about the lore? Well, I think for starters, Rangers are an inherently forward-thinking part of dwarf society. They're already on the margins of their own society, and they're already thought of as being unusual, so I don't think they'd have any issue with the social stigma of handguns, right? If anybody would have no problems using a new technology, it would either be them or the engineers, right? While I grant you that handguns are loud, and thus difficult to use stealthily, I don't think that the loudness is necessarily an issue. In fact, in some cases, I think the loudness can actually be an advantage. We know from our own history that early uses of black powder weapons were far more for shock factor than actual damage. A couple of dozen dwarf handguns all opening fire simultaneously on your camp would definitely throw it into disarray. I think all but the most disciplined fighters would immediately be scrambling in the chaos caused by such a loud raucous and display of firepower. And therefore I think it would make it less likely that you could mount an effective defense. Furthermore, firing the gun doesn't glue the dwarf to the ground. You can't fire a handgun and then move back into cover or reposition it entirely. I mean, that's what people do nowadays with their sniper rifles. In some ways, the enemy might be even more frightened because they know that there's a shooter there, but unless they're elves, they're probably unlikely to see them. Remember, Dwarf Rangers are masters of their terrain. They are as adept in the mountains as the wood elves should be in the woods. For cowardly foes, like goblins or skaven, I think the morale damage that you could do to them with this would be worth more than actual more dead casualties. Finally, while it is true that bolts can be reused, occasionally, that is if the bolt doesn't break, I think it's actually much easier to just make new bullets. All that would be required is lead, fire, a pot, and a cast to recast melted lead into new ammo. These are things that can be easily carried by a dwarf on their trek and made in the field. Bolts generally need to be made in a workshop because they require access to things like lathes, glues, and fletching, and that just makes producing them in the field a lot more cumbersome. Yeah, I think it could be done, especially because dwarves are tenacious and generally good crafters, but I think that a quantity of bolts would carry up more space and weight than a quantity of bullets. I'm sure you could carry a lot of the tools required to make new bolts. I just think it would be more of a hassle to try and make bolts from scratch than it would be to try to make bullets from lead. Personally, it's my belief that it should be an option for Dwarf Rangers to pick between a handgun or a crossbow. In my headcanon, the Rangers might have access to caches of firearms for when they decide they need them. Versatility is the name of the Ranger game, after all. Alright, so that brings me to the end of the video. This channel has been growing a lot lately, thanks to all the new subscribers, and of course the old ones. I hope that you guys are enjoying the videos, and I'm trying to produce smaller videos that I can get done with my more limited time. Remember to like and subscribe and all that. Sharing the video also helps with the YouTube algorithm. Do let me know about what you think about the crossbow versus handgun debate for the Dwarf Ranger. Personally, I think I'd rather them have access to handguns than crossbows, but I can see why rangers might prefer crossbows. Ultimately, I think the best option would simply just be to let them have both. Just pick or choose, maybe spend some point cost to get between a handgun or a crossbow. I guess that would really depend on the balance. I really don't think that it would fundamentally upset the meta if the dwarves could just bring handguns instead of crossbows, but I digress. Until next time, take care and goodbye.